Jesus healed lepers. He forgave sinners. He wept at the tomb of a friend. When soldiers came to arrest him in the garden, he told Peter to put the sword away. He was, by every account, the most patient, most merciful person who ever lived. But there was one thing that made him pick up a whip. One thing that made him flip tables, scatter coins across the stone floor, and drive grown men out of the building. The only time Jesus got physically aggressive was about money. And it wasn't a tantrum. Mark's gospel tells us he visited the temple the day before. He looked around at everything. He said nothing. He went home. And then he came back. This is the story of why. Here's what happened. Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. "It is written," he said to them, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." Now, people hear this and picture a small market, a few guys with a folding table selling pigeons. That's not what this was. This was Passover week. Jerusalem was packed, pilgrims from every corner of the Roman world pouring through the gates. And the temple courts had been turned into an organized commercial operation. Money changers with fixed exchange rates, animal sellers with captive pricing, all of it running in the shadow of God's house. But listen to what Jesus said. He didn't just yell at them. He quoted two prophets in a single sentence. Isaiah, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations," and Jeremiah, "a den of robbers." He didn't grab the nearest insult. He reached back 600 years to Jeremiah. And that choice matters. We'll come back to it. Mark's Gospel, chapter 11, verse 11, tells us that Jesus visited the temple the day before. He walked in, he looked around at everything, and then, because it was already late, he left. He went back to Bethany with the 12. He saw the whole operation, the exchange rates, the markups, the crowds being squeezed, and he said nothing. He went home, he slept on it, and then he came back. This wasn't an outburst. This was a man who saw something that grieved him to his core, went home, and returned with a plan. John's Gospel records a separate incident, possibly years earlier, where Jesus made a whip of cords before clearing the temple. Whether these are two events or one, the pattern is the same. Deliberate, not impulsive. That distinction matters, because it tells you this wasn't about losing his temper. It was about something he could not tolerate. So what exactly was happening in the temple that made Jesus react like this? Follow the money. If you were a pilgrim arriving in Jerusalem for Passover, you carried whatever coins you had, Roman denarii, Greek drachma, local copper, but none of that was accepted for the temple tax. You had to pay in one specific coin, the Tyrian shekel. Why? Because it was between 94 and 97% pure silver. Modern metallurgical analysis of over 800 of these coins has confirmed that. In a world full of debased currency, the Tyrian shekel was honest money. But here's the irony. The Tyrian shekel had a pagan god on the front, Melkart, the chief deity of Tyre, and an eagle on the back, both graven images under Jewish law, and the rabbis accepted it anyway. The Tosefta, that's early rabbinic commentary, says this: silver, whenever mentioned in the Pentateuch, is Tyrian silver. They literally equated God's standard for silver with the coinage of a pagan city. In practice, the rabbis accepted it, choosing honest weight over the image stamped on it. The integrity of the silver mattered more than the picture on the coin. Now, some scholars argue that money changers were performing a necessary service, and maybe they were. Pilgrims needed to convert their coins. But Jesus didn't call them servants. He called them robbers. And he quoted a prophet who said the same thing about the same institution 600 years earlier. Because the money changers had you trapped. You couldn't worship without converting your money. They set the exchange rate. No competition, no alternative. Take it or leave it. But if you leave it, you can't fulfill your obligation to God. And then there were the dove sellers. Doves were the poor person's offering, what you brought when you couldn't afford a lamb. Leviticus lays this out, and these sellers marked them up, knowing the poorest family had no other option. A widow counting her small coins at the dove seller's table, trying to buy the cheapest sacrifice so her family can worship, and they marked it up. You know who else bought doves at that temple? Mary and Joseph. Luke chapter 2 tells us, when they presented the baby Jesus, they offered a pair of turtle doves. That was the poor family's offering. Jesus grew up in a family that was poor enough to bring doves. He knew the kind of people who stood at that table because his own mother had been one of them. And there's one more thing. All of this, the money changers, the animal sellers, the whole operation, it was set up in the court of the Gentiles. That was the only space in the entire temple where non-Jews could come to pray. The one place an outsider could seek God. And they turned it into a marketplace. Now here's what's important to understand. Jesus wasn't angry at the coin. The Tyrian shekel was honest. That's why God's temple required it. 94% pure silver, honest weight. He was angry at the system built around it. Middlemen who took honest money and wrapped a dishonest racket around it. A captive market, exploitative rates, and the poorest paying the highest price. The coin was sound. The institution was corrupt. Remember, Jesus quoted Jeremiah, a den of robbers. That wasn't a throwaway insult. It was a legal indictment. In Jeremiah's time, 600 years earlier, Israel had the same problem. The people would cheat, steal, exploit, and then walk into God's temple and say, "We are safe," as if the building made the sin acceptable. The temple had become a hideout, a place where corruption wore religious clothing. And that's exactly what Jesus saw in the courts that day. The money changers weren't stealing in spite of the temple. They were stealing because of the temple. The institution made the racket look legitimate. So when Jesus stood in the cleared courtyard and called it a den of robbers, he wasn't name-calling. He was pronouncing judgment. The same judgment Jeremiah gave 600 years earlier. Mark tells us what happened next, verse 18. The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him. He had been threatening their authority for years, but when he went after their money, they stopped debating and planned urgently. Days later, they killed him. He knew they would. The Tyrian shekel was chosen because honest weight mattered more than the image on the coin. Similar to the honest weight of the shekel and the limited supply of the metal, Bitcoin is honestly verifiable with math, and its supply is even more limited, 21 million. No one can print more. No one can debase it. Changing that would require a global network of nodes to agree to something that would make them all poorer. And in over 15 years, no one has. It is honest by design. And today, the same governments and banks that debase their own currencies year after year call Bitcoin a tool for criminals. Honest money has always challenged the institutions that profit from dishonest money. Jesus didn't flip the tables because he was having a bad day. He flipped them because dishonest money in God's house was an abomination. It still is. That scene in the temple, that's where this playlist begins. Because Jesus wasn't the only one who cared about honest money. God has been saying this throughout Scripture. Proverbs, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Micah, Amos, Ezekiel, Hosea, book after book, prophet after prophet, the same message. God hates a false balance. And we're going to walk through every one of them. Subscribe if you want to walk through it with me. I'm Patrick, and this is the Gospel of Bitcoin.